Hello, folks. Sorry for the hiatus. Today we are doing chapter 4. Let me do my intro. Welcome to the House of Air book club. Today we're reading chapter 4, which is a correction from one I posted previously, of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. It is the book first of the Belgariad. The seasons turned, as seasons will. Summer ripened into autumn. The blaze of autumn died into winter. Winter grudgingly relented to the urgency of spring, and spring bloomed into summer again. With the turning of the seasons, the years turned, and Garion imperceptibly grew older. As he grew, the other children grew as well, all except poor Darun, who seemed doomed to be short and skinny all his life. Rundorg sprouted like a young tree and was soon almost as big as any man on the farm. Zubret, of course, did not grow so tall, but she developed in other ways which the boys began to find interesting. In the early autumn, just before Garion's 14th birthday, he came very close to ending his career. In response to some primal urge all children have, given a pond and a handy supply of logs, they had built a raft that summer. The raft was neither very large nor was it particularly well built. It had a tendency to sink on one end if the weight aboard it was improperly distributed, and had an alarming habit of coming apart at unexpected moments. Quite naturally, it was Garion who was aboard the raft, showing off, on that fine autumn day when the raft quite suddenly decided once and for all to revert to its original state. The bindings all came undone, and the logs began to go their separate ways. Realizing his danger only at the last moment, Garion made a desperate effort to pull for shore, but his haste only made the disintegration of the craft more rapid. In the end, he found himself standing on a single log, his arms windmilling wildly in a futile effort to regain his balance. His eyes, desperately searching for some aid, swept the marshy shore. Some distance up the slope behind his playmates, he saw the familiar figure of the man on the black horse. The man wore a dark robe, and his burning eyes watched the boy's plight. Then the spiteful log rolled under Garion's feet, and he toppled and fell with a resounding splash. Garion's education, unfortunately, had not included instruction in the art of swimming, and while the water was not really very deep, it was deep enough. The bottom of the pond was very unpleasant, a kind of dark, weedy ooze, inhabited by frogs, turtles, and a singularly unsavory-looking eel that slithered away snake-like when Garion plunged like a sinking rock into the weeds. Garion struggled, gulped water, and launched himself with his legs toward the surface again. Like a broaching whale, he rose from the depths, gasped a couple of quick, sputtering breaths, and heard the screams of his playmates. The dark figure on the slope had not moved, and for a single instant every detail of that bright afternoon was etched on Garion's mind. He even observed that, although the rider was in the open under the full glare of the autumn sun, neither man nor horse cast a shadow. Even as his mind grappled with that impossibility, he sank once more to the murky bottom. It occurred to him as he struggled, drowning, amongst the weeds, that if he could launch himself up in the vicinity of the log, he might catch hold of it and so remain afloat. He waved off a startled-looking frog and plunged upwards again. He came up, unfortunately, directly under the log. The blow on the top of his head filled his eyes with light and his ears with a roaring sound, and he sank, no longer struggling, back toward the weeds which seemed to reach up for him. And then Dernick was there. Garion felt himself lifted roughly by the hair towards the surface, and then towed by that same convenient handle towards shore behind Dernick's powerfully churning strokes. The smith pulled the semi-conscious boy out onto the bank, turned him over, and stepped on him several times to force the water out of his lungs. Garion's ribs creaked. "Enough, Dernick," he gasped finally. He sat up, and the blood from the splendid cut on top of his head immediately ran into his eyes. He wiped the blood clear and looked around for the dark, shadowless rider, but the figure had vanished. He tried to get up, but the world suddenly spun around him, and he fainted. When he awoke, he was in his own bed, with his head wrapped in bandages. Aunt Poll stood beside his bed, her eyes blazing. "You stupid boy!" she cried. "What were you doing in that pond?" "Rafting," Geryon said, trying to make it sound quite ordinary. "Rafting," she said. "Rafting! Who gave you permission?" "Well," he said uncertainly, "we just—" "You just what?" He looked at her helplessly. And then with a low cry she took him in her arms and crushed him to her almost suffocatingly. Briefly Geryon considered telling her about the strange shadowless figure that had watched his struggles in the pond, but the dry voice in his mind that sometimes spoke to him told him that this was not the time for that. He seemed to know somehow that the business between him and the man on the black horse was something very private, and that the time would inevitably come when they would face each other in some kind of contest of will or deed. To speak of it now to Aunt Paul would involve her in the matter, and he did not want that. He was not sure exactly why, but he did know that the dark figure was an enemy, and though that thought was a bit frightening, it was also exciting. There was no question that Aunt Paul could deal with this stranger, but if she did, Geryon knew that he would lose something very personal and for some reason very important, and so he said nothing. "It wasn't really anything all that dangerous, Aunt Paul," he said instead, rather lamely. "I was starting to get the idea of how to swim. I'd have been all right if I hadn't hit my head on that log." "But of course you did hit your head," she pointed out. "Well, yes, but if it wasn't that serious, I'd have been all right in a minute or two." "Under the circumstances, I'm not sure you had a minute or two," she said bluntly. "Well," he faltered, then decided to let it drop. That marked the end of Geryon's freedom. Aunt Paul confined him to the scullery. He grew to know every dent and scratch on every pot in the kitchen intimately. He once estimated gloomily that he washed each one 21 times a week. In a seeming orgy of messiness, Aunt Paul suddenly could not even boil water without dirtying at least 3 or 4 pans, and Geryon had to scrub every one. He hated it and began to think quite seriously of running away. As autumn progressed and the weather began to deteriorate, the other children were also more or less confined to the compound as well, and it wasn't so bad. Rundorg, of course, was seldom with them any more, since his man's size had made him, even more than Geryon, subject to more and more frequent labor. When he could, Geryon slipped away to be with Zubret and Dorun, but they no longer found much entertainment in leaping into the hay, or in the endless games of tag in the stables and barns. They had reached an age and size where adults rather quickly noticed such idleness, and found tasks to occupy them. Most often they would sit in some out-of-the-way place and simply talk, which is to say that Geryon and Zubret would sit and listen to the endless flow of Dorun's chatter. That small, quick boy, as unable to be quiet as he was to sit still, could seemingly talk for hours about a half-dozen raindrops, and his words tumbled out breathlessly as he fidgeted. "What's that mark on your hand, Geryon?" Zubret asked one rainy day, interrupting Dorun's bubbling voice. Geryon looked at the perfectly round, white patch on the palm of his right hand. "I've noticed it too," Dorun said, quickly changing subject in mid-sentence. "But Geryon grew up in the kitchen, didn't you, Geryon? It's probably a place where he burned himself when he was little. Reached out before anyone could stop him and put his hand on something hot. I bet his Aunt Paul got really angry about that, because she can get angrier faster than anyone I've ever seen, and she can really—" "It's always been there," Geryon said, tracing the mark on his palm with his left forefinger. He had never really looked closely at it before. It covered the entire palm of his hand, and had, in certain light, a faint silvery sheen. "Maybe it's a birthmark," Zubret suggested. "I bet that's it," Doreen said quickly. "I saw a man once that had a big purple one on the side of his face, one of those wagoners that comes by to pick up the turnip crop in the fall. Anyway, the mark was all over the side of his face, and I thought it was a big bruise at first and thought that he must have been in an awful fight. Those wagoners fight all the time, but then I saw it wasn't really a bruise, but like Zubret just said, it was a birthmark. I wonder what causes things like that." That evening, after he'd gotten ready for bed, he asked his aunt about it. "What's this mark, Aunt Paul?" he asked, holding his hand up, palm out. She looked up from where she was brushing her long dark hair. "It's nothing to worry about," she told him. "I wasn't worried about it," he said. "I just wondered what it was. Zubret and Dorun think it's a birthmark. Is that what it is?" "Something like that," she said. "Did either of my parents have the same kind of mark?" "Your father did. It's been in the family for a long time." A sudden strange thought occurred to Garyon. Without knowing why, he reached out with a hand and touched a white lock at his aunt's brow. "Is it like that white place in your hair?" he asked. He felt a sudden tingle in his hand, and it seemed somehow that a window opened in his mind. At first there was only the sense of uncountable years moving by like a vast sea of ponderously rolling clouds. And then, sharper than any knife, a feeling of endlessly repeated loss, of sorrow. Then, more recent, there was his own face, and behind it more faces, old, young, regal, or quite ordinary, and behind them all, no longer foolish as it sometimes seemed, the face of Mr. Wolfe. But more than anything, there was a knowledge of an unearthly, inhuman power, the certainty of an unconquerable will. Aunt Paul moved her head away, almost absently. "Don't do that, Garyon," she said, and the window in his mind shut. "What was it?" he asked, burning with curiosity and wanting to open that window again. "A simple trick," she said. "Show me how." "Not yet, my Garyon," she said, taking his face between her hands. "Not yet. You're not ready yet. Now go to bed." "You'll be here?" he asked, a little frightened now. "I'll always be here," she said, tucking him in, and then she went back to brushing her long, thick hair, humming a strange song as she did, in a deep, melodious voice, and to that sound he fell asleep. After that, not even Garyon himself saw the mark on his own palm very often. There suddenly seemed to be all kinds of dirty jobs for him to do, which kept not only his hands, but the rest of him as well, very dirty. The most important holiday in Sendaria, and indeed in the rest of the Kingdom of the West, was Erastide. It commemorated that day, eons before, when the 7 gods joined hands to create the world with a single word. The festival of Erastide took place in midwinter, and because there was little to do on a farm like Faldor's at that season, it had, by custom, become a splendid 2-week celebration with feasts and gifts and decorations in the dining hall and little pageants honoring the gods. These last, of course, were a reflection of Faldor's piety. Faldor, though he were a good, simple man, had no illusions about how widely his sentiments were shared by others on the farm. He thought, however, that some outward show of devotional activity was in keeping with the season, and because he was such a good master, the people on his farm chose to humor him. It was also this season, unfortunately, that Faldor's married daughter, Anhelda, and her husband, Elbrig, made their customary annual visit to remain on speaking terms with her father. Anhelda had no intentions of endangering her inheritance rights by seeming inattention. Her visits, however, were a trial to Faldor, who looked upon his daughter's somewhat overdressed and supercilious husband, a minor functionary in a commercial house in the capital city of Sendar, with scarcely concealed contempt. Their arrival, however, marked the beginning of the Erastide festival at Faldor's farm, so, while no one cared for them personally, their appearance was always greeted with a certain enthusiasm. The weather that year had been particularly foul, even for Sendaria. The rains had settled in early, and were soon followed by a period of soggy snow, not the crisp, bright powder which came later in the winter, but a damp slush, always half melting. For Garyon, whose duties in the kitchen now prevented him from joining with his former playmates in their traditional pre-holiday orgy of anticipatory excitement, the approaching holiday seemed somehow flat and stale. He yearned back to the good old days, and often sighed with regret, and moped about the kitchen like a sandy-haired cloud of doom. Even the traditional decorations in the dining hall, where Erastide festivals always took place, seemed decidedly tacky to him that year. The fir boughs festooning the ceiling beams were somehow not as green, and the polished apples carefully tied to the boughs were smaller and not as red. He sighed some more, and revelled in his sullen moping. Aunt Paul, however, was not impressed, and her attitude was firmly unsympathetic. She routinely checked his brow with her hands for signs of fever, and then dosed him with the foulest-tasting tonic she she could concoct. Geryon was careful after that to mope in private and to sigh less audibly. That dry, secret part of his mind informed him matter-of-factly that he was being ridiculous, but Geryon chose not to listen. The voice in his mind was much older and wiser than he, but it seemed determined to take all the fun out of life. On the morning of Erastide, Emergo and 5 thulls appeared with a wagon outside the gate and asked to see Faldor. Geryon, who had long since learned that no one pays attention to a boy, and that many interesting things may be learned by placing himself in a position to casually overhear conversations, busied himself with some small unimportant chore near the gate. The Mergo, his face scarred much like the face of one in Upper Grault, sat importantly on the wagon seat, his chainmail shirt clinking every time he moved. He wore a black hooded robe, and his sword was much in evidence. His eyes moved constantly, taking in everything. The thulls, in muddy felt boots and heavy cloaks, lounged disinterestedly against their wagon, seemingly indifferent to the raw wind whipping across the snowy fields. Faldor, in his finest doublet, it was, after all, Erastide, came across the yard, closely followed by Anhelda and Elbrig. "Good morrow, friend," Faldor said to the Mergo. "Joyous Erastide to you." The Mergo grunted. "I take it you're the farmer, Faldor?" he asked in a heavily accented voice. "I am," Faldor replied. "I understand you have a goodly number of hams on hand, well cured." "The pigs did well this year," Faldor answered modestly. "I'll buy them," the Mergo announced, jingling his purse. Faldor bowed. "First thing tomorrow morning," he said. The Mergo stared. "This is a pious household," Faldor explained. "We don't offend the gods by breaking the sanctity of Erastide." "Father," Anhelda snapped, "don't be foolish. This noble merchant has come a long way to do business." "Not on Erastide," Faldor said stubbornly, his long face firm. "In the city of Sendar," Elbreg said in his rather high-pitched nasal voice, "we do not let such sentimentality interfere with business." "This is not the city of Sendar," Faldor said flatly. "This is Faldor's farm, and on Faldor's farm we do no work and conduct no business on Erastide." "Father," Anhelda protested, "the noble merchant has gold. Gold, father." "I won't hear any more of it," Faldor announced. He turned to the Mergo. "You and your servants are welcome to join us in our celebration, friend," he said. "We can provide quarters for you and the promise of the finest dinner in all of Sendaria, and the opportunity to honor the gods on this special day. No man is made poorer by attending to his religious obligations." "We do not observe this holiday in Sol Mergos," the scar-faced man said coldly. "As the noble lady says, I've come a long way to do business, and have not much time to tarry. I'm sure there are other farmers in the district with the merchandise I require." "Father," Anhelda wailed. "I know my neighbors," Faldor said quietly. "Your luck today will be small, I fear. The observance of this day is a firm tradition in this area." The Mergo thought for a moment. "It may be as you say," he said finally. "I'll accept your invitation, provided that we can do business as early as possible tomorrow." Faldor bowed. "I'll place myself at your service at first light tomorrow, if you so desire." "Done, then," the Mergo said, climbing down from his wagon. That afternoon the feast was laid in the dining hall. The kitchen helpers and a half-dozen others who had been pressed into service for the special day scurried from kitchen to hall, bearing smoking roasts, steaming hams, and sizzling geese, all under the lash of Aunt Paul's tongue. Geryon observed sourly, as he struggled with an enormous baron of beef, that Faldor's prohibition of work on Erastide stopped at the kitchen door. In time, all was ready. The tables were loaded, the fires in the fireplace burned brightly. Dozens of candles filled the hall with golden light, and torches flared in their rings on the stone pillars. Faldor's people, all in their best clothes, filed into the hall, their mouths watering in anticipation. When all were seated, Faldor rose from his bench at the head of the center table. Dear friends, he said, lifting a tankard, I dedicate this feast to the gods. The gods, the people responded in unison, rising respectfully. Faldor drank briefly, and they all followed suit. Hear me, O gods, he prayed. Most humbly we thank you for the bounty of this fair world which you made on this day, and we dedicate ourselves to your service for yet another year. He looked for a moment as if he were going to say more, but then sat down instead. Faldor always labored for many hours over special prayers for occasions such as this, but the agony of speaking in public invariably erased the words so carefully prepared from his mind. His prayers, therefore, were always very sincere and very short. Eat, dear friends, he instructed. Don't let the food grow cold. And so they ate. Anhelda and Elbrig, who joined them all at this one meal only at Faldor's insistence, devoted their conversational efforts to the Murgo, since he was the only one in the room who was worthy of their attention. I have long thought of visiting Stolmergos, Elbrig stated rather pompously. Don't you agree, friend merchant, that greater contact between East and West is the way to overcome those mutual suspicions which have so marred our relationships in the past? We Murgos prefer to keep to ourselves, the scar-faced man said shortly. But you are here, friend, Elbrig pointed out. Doesn't that suggest that greater contact might prove beneficial? I am here as a duty, the Murgo said. I don't visit here out of preference. He looked around the room. Are these, then, all of your people? He asked Faldor. Every soul is here, Faldor told him. I was led to believe there was an old man here, with white hair and a beard. Not here, friend, Faldor said. I myself am the eldest here, and as you can see, my hair is far from white. One of my countrymen met such a one some years ago, the Murgo said. He was accompanied by an Orendish boy, Rundorig, I believe his name was. Garion, seated at the next table, kept his face to his plate and listened so hard that he thought his ears must be growing. We have a boy named Rundorig here, Faldor said. That tall lad at the end of the table over there, he pointed. No, the Murgo said, looking hard at Rundorig. That is not the boy who was described to me. It's not an uncommon name among Arens, Faldor said. Quite probably your friend met with a pair from another farm. That must be it, the Murgo said, seeming to dismiss the affair. This ham is excellent, he said, pointing at his plate with the point of a dagger with which he ate. Are the ones in your smokehouse of similar quality? Oh no, friend merchant, Faldor laughed. You won't so easily trick me into talking business on this day. The Murgo smiled briefly, the expression appearing strange on his scarred face. One can only try, he said. I would, however, compliment your cook. A compliment for you, Mistress Paul, Faldor said, raising his voice slightly. Our friend from Stolmergos finds your cooking much to his liking. I thank him for his compliment, Aunt Paul said, somewhat coldly. The Murgo looked at her, and his eyes widened slightly, as if in recognition. A noble meal, great lady, he said, bowing slightly in her direction. Your kitchen is a place of magic. No, she said, her face suddenly very haughty. Not magic. Cooking's an art which anyone with patience may learn. Magic is quite something else. But magic is also an art, great lady, the Murgo said. There are many who think so, Aunt Paul said, but true magic comes from within, and isn't the result of nimble fingers which trick the eye. The Murgo stared at her, his face hard, and she returned his gaze with steely eyes. To Garion, sitting nearby, it seemed as if something had passed between them that had nothing to do with the words they spoke. A kind of challenge seemed to hang in the air, and then the Murgo looked away, almost as if he feared to take up that challenge. When the meal was over, it was time for the rather simple pageant which traditionally marked Erastide. 7 of the older farmhands, who had slipped away earlier, appeared in the doorway wearing the long hooded robes and carefully carved and painted masks, which represented the faces of the gods. The costumes were old and showed the wrinkles which were the result of having been packed away in Faldor's attic for the past year. With a slow step, the robed and masked figures paced into the hall and lined up at the foot of the table where Faldor sat. Then each in turn spoke a short piece which identified the god he represented. "I am Aldor," Kralto's voice came from behind the first mask, "the god who dwells alone, and I command this world to be." "I am Balar," came another familiar voice from behind the second mask, "bear god of the Alorns, and I command this world to be." And so it went down the line. Chaldan, Issa, Nedra, Mara, and then finally the last figure, which, unlike the others, was robed in black and whose mask was made of steel instead of painted wood. "I am Torak," Dernick's voice came hollowly from behind the mask, "dragon god of the Angarax, and I command this world to be." A movement caught Garion's eye, and he looked quickly. The Murgo had covered his face with his hands in a strange, almost ceremonial gesture. Beyond him, at the far table, the 5 thulls were ashen-faced and trembling. The 7 figures at the foot of Faldor's table joined their hands. "We are the gods," they said in unison, "and we command this world to be." "Hearken unto the words of the gods," Faldor declaimed. "Welcome are the gods in the house of Faldor." "The blessings of the gods be upon the house of Faldor," the 7 responded, "and upon all this company." And then they turned, and, as slowly as they had come, they paced from the hall. And then came the gifts. There was much excitement at this, for the gifts were all from Faldor, and the good farmer struggled long each year to provide the most suitable gifts for each of his people. New tunics and hose and gowns and shoes were much in evidence, but Garion this year was nearly overwhelmed when he opened a smallish, cloth-wrapped bundle and found a neat, well-sheathed dagger. "He's nearly a man," Faldor explained to Aunt Paul, "and a man always has need of a good knife." Garion, of course, immediately tested the edge of his gift and quite promptly managed to cut his finger. "It was inevitable, I suppose," Aunt Paul said, but whether she was speaking of the cut or the gift itself or the fact of Garion's growing up was not entirely clear. The Murgo bought his hams the next morning, and he and the 5 thulls departed. A few days later, Anhelda and Elbrig packed up and left on their return journey to the city of Sendar, and Faldor's farm returned to normal. The winter plodded on, the snows came and went, and spring returned, as it always does. The only thing which made that spring any different from any other was the arrival of Brill, a new hand. One of the younger farmers had married and rented a small nearby croft and had left, laden down with practical gifts and good advice from Faldor to begin his life as a married man. Brill was hired to replace him. Garion found Brill to be a definitely unattractive addition to the farm. The man's tunic and hose were patched and stained, his black hair and scraggly beard were unkempt, and one of his eyes looked off in a different direction from its fellows. He was a sour, solitary man, and he was none too clean. He seemed to carry with him an acrid reek of stale sweat that hung in his vicinity like a miasma. After a few attempts of conversation, Garion gave up and avoided him. The boy, however, had other things to occupy his mind during that spring and summer. Though he had until then considered her to be more of an inconvenience than a genuine playmate, quite suddenly he began to notice Zubret. He had always known that she was pretty, but until that particular season that fact had been unimportant, and he had much preferred the company of Rendorig or Darun. Now matters had changed. He noticed that the 2 other boys had also begun to pay more attention to her as well, and for the first time he began to feel the stirrings of jealousy. Zubret, of course, flirted outrageously with all 3 of them, and positively glowed when they glared at each other in her presence. Rendorig's duties in the fields kept him away most of the time, but Darun was a serious worry to Garion. He became quite nervous, and frequently found excuses to go about the compound to make certain that Darun and Zubret were not alone together. His own campaign was charmingly simple. He resorted to bribery. Zubret, like all little girls, was fond of sweets, and Garion had access to the entire kitchen. In a short period of time they had worked out an arrangement. Garyon would steal sweets from the kitchen for his sunny-haired playmate, and in return she would let him kiss her. Things might perhaps have gone further if Aunt Poll had not caught them in the midst of such an exchange one bright summer afternoon in the seclusion of the hay barn. "That's quite enough of that," she announced firmly from the doorway. Garyon jumped guiltily away from Zubrette. "I've got something in my eye," Zubrette lied quickly. "Garyon was trying to get it out for me." Garyon stood blushing furiously. "Really?" Aunt Poll said. "How interesting. Come with me, Garyon." He started. "Now, Garyon." And that was the end of that. Garyon's time thereafter was totally occupied in the kitchen, and Aunt Poll's eyes seemed to be on him every moment. He mooned about a great deal, and worried desperately about Daroon, who now appeared hatefully smug, but Aunt Poll remained watchful, and Garyon remained in the kitchen. Thank you for listening along with us. This book is usually available wherever your favorite books can be found. For more chapters, see the playlist below. Like or subscribe if that's your thing. We love you like burning. Bye-bye.